names carry silence until the world is forced to remember them. Let us know in the comment section below if you've ever witnessed someone underestimated, only to rise in a way no one saw coming. Mr. Briggs, are you hard of hearing or just being difficult today? The judge's voice ricocheted through the courtroom like a cracked gavel. He leaned forward, both hands pressed against the mahogany bench, as if the force of his stare might crush the fragile man standing before him. Walter Briggs didn't answer right away. He stood at the defendant's table in a second-hand suit that hung a little too loose on his frame, shoulders sloped, not in shame, but from time. His fingers clutched the brim of a well-worn cap in front of him. The patch on it read U.S. Army Veteran, its edges frayed, the embroidery faded. He hadn't worn it to earn favor, it was just him. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Walter said, voice dry but steady. "Could you repeat that?" The courtroom barely hid its collective sigh. One young attorney in the back whispered something into her phone. A bailiff smirked without turning his head. Even the stenographer, who should have been neutral, rolled her eyes so slightly that only someone watching for it, someone like Walter, would notice. "I said," Judge Randall Coker repeated, louder this time, "this hearing is a formality. You're behind on property taxes and code violations. You've ignored multiple notices. You've wasted the court's time. What part of that confuses you?" Walter blinked slowly, then gave a small shake of his head. "None of it confuses me. I just didn't know the court started measuring justice in terms of speed and sarcasm." A few heads turned at that. Judge Coker's brow lifted, amused and mildly irritated. "Well, Mr. Briggs, perhaps if you'd responded to your citations instead of spending time coming up with clever replies, you wouldn't be here. You've had every opportunity to comply with the city's mandates. Do you have a defense?" Walter cleared his throat, looking down briefly at the cap in his hands. He didn't need a defense. He needed someone to listen. "There's not much I can say," he began. "My wife passed 2 winters ago. I've been trying to keep up with the house, but the roof collapsed in the back. I used to fix things myself, but—" He tapped his leg with his knuckles. The faint metallic clink told the story. He didn't want to. The judge glanced down at the file again. "You live alone?" "I do." "No children to assist you?" Walter's silence stretched a little too long. Finally he muttered, "Not nearby." The courtroom was stale with expectation. Coker let the pause hang. "You're in violation of health codes and public safety standards. If you can't maintain your property, we have a responsibility to ensure the safety of the neighborhood." Walter's jaw tensed. "It's my house. Bought it in '66 with money I saved while stationed in Okinawa. I'm not hurting anyone. The street's quieter than ever." Judge Coker exhaled, leaning back now. "This isn't about history. It's about liability. If a child wanders onto your land and gets injured—" "There are no children on my street," Walter interrupted quietly. "But there could be." Coker's voice hardened again. "And this court cannot overlook potential risks because you're nostalgic." Walter said nothing. He just looked at the judge. Not in defiance, not in fear. Just looked. And in that still gaze was something deeper than objection. Something old. Something earned. But Randall Coker had no patience for subtext. To him, every delay was a waste. Every minute not moving a docket was time stolen from his next self-congratulatory lunch. "The city is recommending an enforced sale and removal," the judge said. "Do you contest that?" Walter's throat tightened. He felt the familiar knot building there, the one he hadn't let rise since Margaret died. But he forced it down. "I contest that I'm not a hazard. I'm just old." Coker clicked his tongue. "Mr. Briggs, aging is not a defense in this court." "No," Walter said, eyes narrowing. "But maybe it should be." Someone in the back murmured, and the bailiff gave them a warning glance. The judge glanced at the man beside Walter. Some public defender assigned last minute who hadn't even read the full file. "Your client planning to call any witnesses?" The lawyer looked startled. No, Your Honor. We didn't prepare any." Coker nodded. "Then, unless Mr. Briggs has some miracle up his sleeve, this court is prepared to rule." The doors opened. Not just opened, swung wide, creaking like something from an old Western film. And in stepped a man in full U.S. Army dress uniform, green coat, service ribbons, a polished nameplate that read Briggs, and, more than anything, 4 silver stars gleaming across his shoulders. The murmurs began instantly, first from one side of the courtroom, then the other. Phones rose, recording before anyone even thought to stop them. Judge Coker looked up, squinting, clearly irritated. "Excuse me," he barked. "This is a court in session, bailiff." But the bailiff had already stood back instinctively. Not out of confusion, out of respect. The man walked forward, posture exact. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on Walter, and then, at last, on the judge. "My apologies, Your Honor," he said, voice clear, sharp, and unshakable. "I'm here as a material witness on behalf of the defendant. Retired General Michael Briggs, United States Army." Walter didn't move, didn't smile, but the grip on his cap slackened. The courtroom fell to a hush so sudden it felt physical. Even the ceiling fans seemed to hum quieter. Judge Coker, now visibly thrown, adjusted his robe and cleared his throat. "General Briggs, this is an administrative hearing, not a military tribunal. Your presence, while notable, doesn't necessarily entitle you—" "With respect, Judge," General Briggs interrupted, "my presence here absolutely entitles me to speak. You're discussing property my father purchased after returning from service. You're questioning his character, and you're doing it with less dignity than a first-year ROTC cadet." It was a quiet thunderclap, and though it wasn't clear yet who would win, or what cards were still to be played, one thing was certain. This was no longer just a case about property. It was about a man, a family, and what this country chooses to remember or forget. The judge shifted, trying to regain the rhythm he'd lost. "Then you may proceed." Briefly. General Briggs stepped closer, never taking his eyes off the bench. But his next words would not come right away, because some truths take longer to surface, especially the ones this courtroom was about to hear. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like a test. General Michael Briggs stood tall at the front of the courtroom, his polished shoes anchored on the faded tile floor like he was back in a forward operating base in Kandahar. His presence alone had shifted the gravity in the room. Even the judge, previously smug and dismissive, now looked as if he was trying to remember where his authority had gone. It wasn't gone, not officially, but the air had turned, and everyone felt it. Walter didn't look at his son. Not yet. He wasn't ready to. There was something about pride and shame that became complicated when a child became more powerful than the parent. Even if the pride outweighed everything, the guilt for needing help sometimes spoke louder. The judge broke the stillness first. His voice clipped and forced. "General Briggs, we'll allow a short statement. I trust you understand this court's time constraints." Michael turned his head, slowly, as if the judge had just given an order that needed reconsidering. "I've been under fire in 3 countries, Your Honor. I've spoken at NATO conferences. I've stood on the White House lawn and buried soldiers younger than my own son. So yes, I understand time. I understand it better than most." Judge Coker blinked. He opened his mouth to respond, then thought better of it. He gave a nod that wasn't quite respectful, but it wasn't defiant either. Michael's attention returned to the room. He scanned the walls, the chairs, the people lining the back, and the faint sound of someone typing too quickly on a phone. And then, finally, he looked at his father. He hadn't seen him in person in over 2 years. They talked, sure, more than many fathers and sons did, but seeing him now, smaller than Michael remembered, weathered by more than time, hit him harder than he expected. The old man still stood like a soldier, even in his crumpled suit. "My father is not a complicated man," Michael began, facing the judge now but speaking to the entire room. "He's not someone who asks for anything. Not when I was a kid and not after I left for West Point. He didn't ask when Mom passed. Didn't ask when the roof caved in. Didn't even tell me about this hearing. I found out because one of my soldiers saw a notice online. There was a shifting of weight in the gallery. Someone coughed quietly. Walter Briggs is the reason I am who I am, and that's not just sentimentality. That's infrastructure, foundation. The kind you don't see until a storm hits and you realize everything's still standing because of what someone else built." He stepped forward again, resting his fingertips gently on the wooden defense table beside his father. "This man fought in the frozen valleys of Korea, took a round in the thigh, and didn't even tell the family until I was old enough to ask why he limped. He raised me on a code, not just yes sir, no sir manners, but the kind of code that means you pay your dues, not complain about them. You fix what's broken. You show up when nobody else will." He paused, looked at the judge, and then round the room again. "And now you want to take his house." Judge Coker lifted a hand as if to interject, but Michael's voice rose just slightly, firm but not yelling, just enough that the judge lowered the hand again. "I'm not here to make threats. That's not how I was trained. But I am here to say that no man, least of all a veteran who's given more than this courtroom will ever know, should be humiliated for falling behind while trying to hold on to a memory." The judge leaned forward. "General Briggs, this court operates on precedent and code. We don't weigh sentiment." "No," Michael cut in sharply. "You weigh paperwork, numbers, checkboxes. But behind every checkbox is a name. And behind every name, a story. You don't have to care about that, but I do." Walter exhaled quietly. He still hadn't spoken. He just watched his son with the same expression he used to wear at Michael's Little League games, only tighter, sadder. Michael reached into his inside jacket pocket and withdrew a manila folder. Neat, sealed. He handed it to the bailiff without looking, eyes still locked on the judge. "I've already contacted contractors. I've paid for structural repair out of my personal account. The mold inspection is scheduled for Thursday. The roof will be replaced next week, and I've transferred the property taxes for the next 2 years. Receipts and documentation are in that folder." The judge looked stunned. "You've done all this in the last 24 hours? "I've done all this because I was raised to act when someone you love is in trouble, even if they're too proud to say it." Finally, Walter spoke. "Michael," he said, softly, "you didn't have to." "I know," Michael replied, just as soft. "But I did." The judge shifted in his seat. "Well, that changes the matter substantially. If the violations have been addressed and the taxes paid, the city has no grounds for enforced action." He looked toward the city's legal representative, who stood and offered a silent nod. Flipping quickly through the papers the bailiff handed him. "I suppose this matter is now moot," the judge said, clearly annoyed he couldn't salvage his authority. "Mr. Briggs, you are dismissed. The court acknowledges the actions taken by your son." Walter gave a small, tired nod. "Appreciate it." "And, General," the judge added, still attempting to regain some control, "perhaps next time you'll let the system run its course before intervening." Michael straightened. "With respect, Your Honor, this was the system running its course. I simply showed up." He turned. His eyes landed on the people in the back of the courtroom, some who had watched with sympathy, others with skepticism, a few with shame. Then he looked at Walter, who still hadn't put his cap back on. "You ready to go home, Dad?" Walter looked down at the cap in his hands. Then, slowly, he placed it back on his head and stood, taller than anyone expected a man of his age could. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." They walked out side by side. No dramatic music, no applause. Just two men, one built by war, the other built by him, moving through the same doors that had tried to shrink Walter down to a case number. The world outside hadn't changed. But maybe, just maybe, everyone inside that courtroom had. Michael hadn't said much on the ride home. The hum of the engine filled the silence between father and son, with only the occasional turn signal or sigh breaking it. Walter stared out the window, fingers laced loosely in his lap. The world outside moved with a blur that didn't match the stillness inside the car. They passed the old gas station on Hollow Creek Road, the one with the faded Route 52 sign that Walter used to take Michael to for sodas after school. It was boarded up now, grass breaking through the asphalt, like time was chewing on the edges of the town, bit by bit. "You didn't have to do all that," Walter said at last, not looking away from the window. Michael kept his eyes on the road. "I know," and figured it out. "I know that too." Walter shifted slightly in his seat. "But you didn't even call first. Just showed up in a courtroom like some kind of cavalry?" "I showed up because I read what they were doing, and you wouldn't have told me." Walter didn't deny it. The truth had a way of settling between them like smoke, thick and impossible to ignore, but not always spoken of. The tires crackled over the gravel as Michael pulled into the driveway. The house looked exactly as he remembered it, and entirely different at the same time. The same white paint, now peeling in long curls. The same porch swing, though one chain hung looser than the other. A familiar structure made unfamiliar by erosion. Walter unbuckled his seatbelt, but didn't open the door yet. "It's not about pride," he said quietly. Michael waited. "It's about history. About not needing to be rescued in a place I spent 60 years building." Michael nodded slowly. "And it's also about knowing when to let someone stand beside you. Not in front of you, not over you, beside you." Walter exhaled, the kind of breath that leaves the ribs a little more fragile when it's done. He opened the door and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his old leather shoes. Michael followed, adjusting his dress uniform jacket as he stood. His boots were clean, his movements precise, but he took in the house with eyes that saw beyond military order. The front door creaked open before they reached it. It was Mrs. Dolores Carson, their next-door neighbor for over 40 years. She held a tray with 2 bowls of potato salad and a look of cautious curiosity. "I saw you two pull in," she said, smiling faintly. "Figured you wouldn't have eaten." Walter offered a thin smile. "Thanks, Dolores, but we're fine." "You say that every time, and every time you're lying." She handed the tray to Michael, who nodded in thanks. Walter started up the porch steps, but stopped as the left one groaned under his weight. Michael noticed instantly. "Contractors will fix that this week." Walter didn't answer. He just grunted softly and continued inside. The living room hadn't changed. The same brown recliner with the upholstery torn slightly along the arm, the same bookshelf with faded encyclopedias, a couple of medals in a shadow box, and a single framed photo of a woman whose absence still echoed louder than any sound. Margaret Briggs, wife, mother, nurse. The one person who had ever managed to get both Briggs men to sit down and shut up when it mattered. Michael glanced at the photo and felt the familiar squeeze in his chest. "She'd be yelling at us both right now," he said. Walter lowered himself into the recliner with a grunt. "She'd be yelling at you. She always liked me better." Michael let out a small, unexpected laugh. "She didn't like either of us when we were being stupid, and we've both been doing plenty of that." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the occasional clink of a spoon against the side of the bowl. Michael finally spoke again. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" Walter chewed slower, then set his spoon down carefully. "Because it wasn't your burden. I fought my wars, built my life, kept this place standing through layoffs, through winters, through losing your mother. I wasn't going to call in the cavalry because the gutters rusted out and the city got impatient. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "But I am the cavalry dad you raised me to be. You don't just turn that off because it makes you uncomfortable to lean on someone." Walter looked at his son now, really looked at him, not just the medals or the ribbons or the crispness of the uniform. He saw the same boy who used to leave his army men scattered on the kitchen floor, the one who saluted at age 7 because it made Mom smile. "They didn't want pity," Walter said. Michael's voice softened. "And what makes you think that's what I—" Walter hesitated. "Is it so hard," Michael continued, "to believe that a son can just want to protect his father? Not out of pity, not out of obligation, just because he loves him?" Walter turned his eyes away again. "Not out of disrespect, but because love that pure is sometimes too bright to look at head-on." "I missed your promotion," Walter said after a long moment. "I know. I didn't want to show up walking with a cane. I didn't want to embarrass you." Michael's eyebrows lifted. "You think that would have embarrassed me?" Walter shrugged, uncomfortable. "Everyone in full dress standing tall, and then me, old and hunched, limping in late. I didn't want to be the asterisk in your story." Michael stood suddenly, crossing to the shadow box. He opened the glass cover gently and lifted the old bronze star that sat beside a folded flag. He walked back to his father, knelt beside him, and placed the medal in Walter's lap. "You're not an asterisk. You're the beginning of the story. And every stripe on my shoulder starts with this." Walter didn't speak. His hands closed around the medal. Michael stood, straightening again. "You're not done here. You're not forgotten, and you're not alone. So whatever comes next, repairs, rebuilding, the neighbors whispering about the courtroom circus, you're not facing it without backup." Walter looked up. His eyes weren't watery, but they were deeper now, like something inside had cracked just enough to let light in again. "I should have called you," he said. Michael nodded once. "Yeah, you should have." And then, quietly, "But I'm here now." Outside, the late afternoon sun slipped behind clouds, and the wind picked up ever so slightly. The swing on the porch moved just an inch, groaning like an old memory not yet ready to rest. And inside that weathered house, the war between pride and love quietly declared a ceasefire. The next morning started earlier than either of them expected. Walter was already up, seated on the edge of his bed with his socks only halfway on, staring at the floor like it held answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon, but a soft glow crept through the edges of the curtains. His back ached, his knee burned, and the phantom weight of yesterday's courtroom lingered like smoke in his lungs. But his house was still his. He looked over at the small wooden box on his dresser. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, yellowed with time, was his old uniform. He hadn't opened it in years, not since Margaret folded it the day after his retirement ceremony, her hands soft and careful, like she was touching something sacred. He didn't wear it anymore, not out of shame, but because he'd assumed it had served its time. Just like him. The floorboard creaked down the hall. Michael was up, probably pacing the kitchen, planning things, arranging and coordinating like he always had, even as a kid, organizing G.I. Joes into battle formations on the living room rug. Walter finished pulling on his socks and stood slowly. The box on the dresser drew his eyes again. He hesitated, then reached for it. In the kitchen, Michael was at the table with his laptop open, 2 phones beside it, and a yellow legal pad filled with names and numbers. He looked up as Walter entered, eyes flicking quickly to assess posture, breathing, expression, military habits that hadn't left him even in retirement. "Morning," he said. Walter gave a nod. "Coffee?" Michael stood and poured a fresh cup. "Already on it." Walter sat down slowly, his hand curling around the mug as if testing its warmth against the chill in his bones. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at the pages scattered across the table. Michael offered a small shrug. "Just making sure everything goes smooth. Contractors are set for Friday. The roof, the porch. Even found a guy who specializes in vintage siding. Says he can match the original paneling. Walter took a sip, let it sit in his mouth a moment before swallowing. You don't have to do it all. I know, Michael replied, sliding a pen across a checklist. But I want to. There was no tension in the words, only fact, and that made them harder to argue with. Walter looked at his son, really looked, the precise way he folded each document, the clean-shaven jaw that used to be soft with boyish roundness, the forearms beneath the rolled-up sleeves that were lean and tough from years of discipline. Michael had grown into a man the world respected, but still walked like someone who carried a ghost on each shoulder. "Let me help with something," Walter said. Michael raised an eyebrow. "You sure? I didn't fight half a war and build this house with my hands to sit in a chair while my kid does everything." Michael smiled faintly. "All right, we'll start with the garage. Needs clearing before they start framing." They worked side by side, the silence between them no longer strained, just full of the sounds of tools clanking, cardboard ripping, and old memories resurfacing like dust in the air. They unearthed a snowblower from 1982, 2 crates of mildewed National Geographics, and a rusted coffee can filled with nails sorted by size. A Margaret touch, no doubt. Halfway through, Michael opened a battered storage trunk and froze. Inside, folded neatly under a plastic sheet, was a framed commendation, a photo of Walter with his unit in Korea, and a stack of letters, each labeled in Margaret's neat handwriting. When Michael was born, his first day of school, boot camp, deployment. Michael picked one up, eyes flicking across the yellowed envelope. "You kept all these?" Walter didn't answer right away. He stood in the doorway of the garage, squinting slightly at the sunlight. "She wrote every time you were gone," he said at last. "Didn't matter if you could read them then. Said one day you'd need to remember how you were loved." Michael didn't say anything. He just held the letter for a moment longer, then placed it back carefully. They cleared the rest in silence. By late afternoon, the garage was empty, swept, and echoing. Walter leaned against the doorframe, watching the light spill in from the open door. "You know," he said, "I haven't worn it since the day I came home." Michael turned toward him. Walter's jaw moved slowly, as if testing the feel of the words. "My uniform. Didn't see the point. Felt like I left that part of me in the jungle somewhere. Brought home the body, sure, but not the rest." Michael didn't push, just waited. Walter scratched the back of his neck. "But yesterday, watching you walk in, straight-backed and sharp like that, 4 stars on your shoulder and fire in your voice, I remembered who I was, what I used to mean." Michael crossed the room, standing just a few feet from his father. "You still mean that?" he said. Walter nodded, then pulled a small bundle from behind him, wrapped in a sheet, neatly pressed. He unfolded it slowly. The olive drab of the jacket still held its shape. The brass buttons dulled, but intact. His name patch? Briggs. Threadbare, but legible. He held it up to the light. "Think it still fits?" Michael chuckled. "Only one way to find out." Walter disappeared into the house for a few minutes. When he returned, something shifted in the air. He stood in the threshold, buttoned all the way up, belt cinched tight, ribbons aligned over his heart. His shoulders had straightened without effort. His chin lifted. He looked like a soldier, not pretending, not reminiscing, but being. Michael didn't speak. He simply lifted a hand, then gave a sharp, precise salute. Walter returned it. 2 men, 1 bloodline, 2 uniforms, different eras, same backbone. The moment passed, but its weight remained. Walter looked down at himself and smiled. Small, lopsided, but real. "Still fits," he said. "Of course it does," Michael replied. That night, they sat on the porch. Neighbors walked by, some waving, some stopping to say hello, more than a few asking about the courtroom scene they'd read about online. A couple even brought pies. Walter accepted them with his usual brevity, but the pride was impossible to hide. "You made a stir," Dolores Carson said with a chuckle. "Half the town's talking about how that judge looked ready to swallow his gavel." Walter smirked. Didn't do much. Just stood there. "Sometimes that's all it takes," she said, patting his shoulder before walking back across the lawn. The stars came out slowly, one at a time. Walter leaned back in his chair, the swing creaking beside him where Michael sat. "You think people forget us when we get old?" Walter asked suddenly. Michael tilted his head. "Some do." "And the rest?" "They remember when it matters." Walter nodded slowly. "Then maybe all this wasn't for nothing?" Michael looked over. "No, Dad, it never was." The wind moved gently through the trees, and for the first time in years, Walter Briggs didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a man remembered. The courthouse looked different when Walter walked back through its doors, though the building hadn't changed a brick. It was the same tan stone, the same metal detector, the same buzz of people rushing past with armfuls of documents and phones that never stopped ringing. But for Walter, everything about the place felt new now. Not because the hallways had been scrubbed or the flag replaced, but because this time he wasn't walking in alone. He had Michael at his side again. Not in uniform this time, just slacks and a button-down shirt, but still carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced a courtroom days earlier. Walter hadn't asked to come back. Michael had. "You're not finished here," he'd said that morning, standing by the kitchen window as sunlight spilled over the sink. "It's not just about fixing your house. It's about setting something straight." So Walter had put on his one good pair of shoes, the ones with soles worn down to the stitching, and buttoned up his cleanest flannel. He still didn't know exactly what his son had planned. They entered the main hearing room. It wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. A few familiar faces from their neighborhood were seated in the gallery. There was Dolores Carson, holding a worn, leather-bound notebook in her lap like a reporter from a quieter time. Beside her, Mr. Blevins from down the street, who still mowed his own lawn with a push-mower, even though his hands trembled. And then there were the strangers. A man with a DSLR camera hanging around his neck, a young woman with a tablet and a press badge clipped to her scarf. Walter glanced at Michael, who simply offered a small nod. He understood now. Whatever had started in that courtroom days ago hadn't ended when the gavel fell. It had spread. When Judge Coker entered, he looked noticeably less sure of himself than before. He paused for a moment as if trying to calculate how to walk across the room without acknowledging the eyes that had multiplied in his presence. "Let's begin," he said curtly. "This is a continuation of Case 24 CV7111 regarding code enforcement citations and civil penalties associated with the property at 402 West Clay Street." Walter stood. Michael remained seated but pulled out a small stack of folders from his briefcase and handed them to the court clerk. "General Briggs," the judge began, trying to maintain some form of control, "you're not the property owner, so unless you have specific new evidence or legal cause—" "I'm not speaking today," Michael interrupted calmly. "He is." He nodded to Walter. Judge Coker raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Briggs, you already offered testimony." "I didn't testify," Walter said. "I just answered questions. Today I'd like to speak properly." The judge leaned back. "Very well. You may proceed." Walter turned to face the room. Not just the judge, the room. His knees ached, and the words weren't eager to come, but he didn't rush. "When I came in here last time," he began, voice low but clear, "I was treated like a man whose time had passed." A few heads nodded in the gallery. I wasn't angry about that, not at first. I figured maybe that's just the way things are now. Old men get brushed aside. Your medals don't matter if your mailbox is crooked. Doesn't matter that you laid the first pipe under your own porch. If you don't fill out the right form or answer the right summons, you're a problem, a number, a ha-" He paused. But then I saw my son walk in, and I remembered something I hadn't felt in a while. Dignity. Michael looked down at his lap. My son didn't fight wars so I could be silenced in a courtroom. I didn't raise him on values so those values could be dismissed like trash on the curb. And I didn't survive Korea just to come home and get told my life was out of compliance. The judge shifted uncomfortably. Walter wasn't looking at him anymore. He was speaking to everyone. Being a veteran isn't a free pass. I'm not asking for a parade every time I walk down the street. I'm asking for recognition that the people who kept this country upright don't deserve to be shoved to the edges of it. There was silence. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. Walter turned back to the judge. I've paid the penalties. The house is being repaired. The taxes are current. But there's something left undone. You tried to strip my dignity in public, Judge. I think it's only right you acknowledge that in public, too. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The weight of his words didn't require applause. The judge cleared his throat. This court does not apologize for enforcing the law. Walter nodded once. Then I don't expect an apology. I expect a correction. Judge Coker looked at the papers before him. According to recent documents, the property at 402 West Clay is now in full compliance. As such, all active penalties are dismissed. Case is closed. Walter didn't move. Neither did anyone else. The judge hesitated. Is there anything further? Michael stood now, calmly. He stepped up beside his father. With your permission, he said, I'd like to submit a motion. Coker's eyes narrowed. On what basis? Michael reached into his folder again. I've drafted a proposal with the assistance of City Council and the Veterans Affairs Office. We're requesting that the City of Parkfield designate a day each year to formally recognize its local veterans. A civic recognition day, not just parades, but service opportunities, repairs for elderly vets, basic recognition programs, starting with the restoration of 402 West Clay Street. There were gasps now, not because it was controversial, but because it was new. The judge blinked. You're proposing a holiday? A local day of service, one that's more than words, one that makes sure the next Walter Briggs isn't put on trial for being forgotten. The judge looked at the gallery, then at the press row now scribbling frantically. And you've already spoken with counsel? Michael nodded. The two members are already drafting language. Coker looked at Walter, then Michael, looking down at the motion, and he sighed. This is outside the authority of this court to enact. However, I will forward this to the city manager's office with my support. Michael offered a respectful nod. That's all we ask. Walter turned to leave, but paused. He looked back one more time. In his tone, he smiled. Not the smile of a man who won, but of a man who had finally been heard. He walked out of the courtroom slowly, his hand brushing along the smooth wood of the doorframe as he passed through. The courtroom didn't erupt, but the town would. In conversations, on message boards, in school hallways and council chambers, because sometimes one man standing with quiet resolve can turn an entire system's volume down long enough for it to listen. And that was the beginning of something better. 2 weeks later, the first ladder went up. Walter sat on the porch with his usual coffee mug, this one less chipped than the others, and watched as the young contractor scaled the roofline like a squirrel in a hard hat. The man's boots clunked against the freshly reinforced shingles, and every so often he'd glance down to check the angle of the flashing or to shout instructions to the guy below. Michael wasn't there that morning, but he'd be back soon. He was giving a talk at the local high school about leadership, invited by the principal herself after catching wind of what had unfolded in the courthouse. Walter had tried to tease him about it. Didn't think generals got sent to detention halls. But the truth was, he was proud. The porch had been rebuilt too. The wood gleamed a little too brightly in the sunlight, not yet weathered to match the old bones of the house. But it stood firm now, and the steps no longer cried out under his weight. A local Boy Scout troop had offered to stain it once everything dried. One of the dads had done a tour in Desert Storm and called Walter an anchor in this town. Walter didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and offered them lemonade when they finished. That's how things had changed. People didn't just wave from a distance anymore. They stopped. They helped. They asked questions about the war and listened to the answers. A local bakery left warm bread at his door last week. The high school art class had started a mural downtown, half of it dedicated to the town's veterans, with a sketch of Walter's silhouette already penciled in near the center. The city council voted unanimously to approve Briggs Day, a civic recognition holiday slated for next year. Michael had offered to help organize it, but Walter shook his head. "It's not my holiday," he said. "It's everyone's." When Michael got back that afternoon, he found Walter in the garage, sorting through the old tools with care. "You organizing or just staring at stuff again?" Michael asked, stepping through the doorway with a half smile. Walter gave a mock glare. "I'm calibrating the territory." Michael chuckled. "The students wanted to know if you were real." Walter raised an eyebrow. "I get that a lot. They said I made you sound like some kind of Clint Eastwood character." "Well," Walter said, setting down an old drill with a thunk, "he's taller." They stood for a moment in the dusty light, surrounded by the smells of oil, wood, and the past. Michael looked around, then leaned against the workbench. "I'm thinking of staying a little longer." Walter didn't answer right away. He just kept reorganizing the socket wrenches. "I know you've got things waiting back at the base," he said after a while. "I do, but they're not going anywhere. I'm on personal leave. Nobody questions a 4-star unless they want to be mopping latrines for the rest of the quarter." Walter gave a quiet huff of amusement. "Wouldn't mind the company. House creaks less when someone's walking through it." Michael nodded. Then it settled. In the days that followed, Walter noticed something he hadn't seen in years. Kids riding their bikes past the house again. Parents weren't telling them to steer clear. They waved. Some even walked up the path, introduced themselves. One little boy, maybe 8 years old, handed Walter a paper he'd drawn. A simple sketch of a house with an American flag and 2 stick figures, one small, one tall, both in uniform. "Is that us?" Walter asked. The boy grinned. "My dad says you're a hero, so I wanted to draw you a picture." Walter tried to speak, but his throat closed up. Instead, he ruffled the boy's hair and thanked him the only way he could, with a smile and a soft, "You did good, son." The world hadn't suddenly turned perfect. The mailbox still leaned a little to the left. Walter's knee still acted up when the clouds gathered. He still missed Margaret in 1,000 small, silent ways. But things were lighter. He was no longer invisible. One Saturday, Michael found him sitting on the swing, looking out over the street as the sun dipped low. The sky was the kind of blue that only came after a storm had passed. Michael handed him a cold bottle of root beer, glass, not plastic, just like Walter used to get him when he was 10. "You ever think we'd get here?" Michael asked. Walter swirled the bottle once before answering, "Didn't think I'd get through here." Michael took the other seat, letting the swing creak slowly beneath their weight. "You know, I used to think being strong meant standing alone," he said. "Carrying your own weight, never asking for help." Walter nodded. "Same. But that day in court, I saw something shift in people. It wasn't just about laws or taxes. It was about what we've let ourselves forget." Walter didn't reply. He watched a pair of robins fight over a worm near the sidewalk. Then he leaned back against the swing. "I think we all forget sometimes," he said, "until someone reminds us." The sun slid lower, shadows stretching across the yard. Lights flicked on in windows up and down the block. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Michael said. Walter looked over. "I'm proud of you, son." They didn't say anything else for a while. They didn't need to. That night, Walter tucked the boy's drawing into the edge of the mirror above the fireplace. He stood there for a long minute, looking at the stick figures, the little flag flapping in a cartoon wind. Then he turned out the light and went to bed. Across town, the council was already planning next year's celebration. Flags were being ordered. A group of veterans had volunteered to speak at schools. Someone had even commissioned a bronze plaque with Walter's name etched in bold letters at the top, beneath the words, "Service never grows old." And as the stars filled the sky over Parkfield, Missouri, the house at 402 West Clay stood quietly, light glowing from its windows like a heartbeat. Not just a house restored, but a life remembered, a legacy honored, and a man finally seen.